Between January and February 2025, several individuals were executed across the United States. In this video, we retrace their final path, from the crimes that led them to death row to the meals they ordered and the last words they ever spoke.
There's many innocent people here on death row or in prison that shouldn't be here.
Stay with us and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? On January 31st, 2025, after spending over 22 years on death row, Marion Bowman Jr. was executed by lethal injection at Broad River Correctional Institution in South Carolina. He had been sentenced to death in 2002 for the murder of Candy Louise Martin, a 21-year-old woman whose body was found burned in the trunk of her own car. Bowman, who always proclaimed his innocence, spent his final days writing poetry and under constant surveillance. But the events of a cold February night in 2001 marked the beginning of the end. This documentary contains factual descriptions that may be sensitive to some viewers. It is presented with care, respect, and the intention to inform. Marion Bowman Jr. was born on June 6, 1980, in the town of Branchville, South Carolina. He grew up in an extremely dysfunctional family environment, with serious alcoholism issues on his mother's side. From a very young age, he was exposed to neglect, alcohol abuse, and a criminal environment. By the age of 10, he was regularly drinking alcohol, and by 14, he was actively involved in drug dealing, especially crack cocaine in his community. During the 1990s, he accumulated criminal records for offenses such as third-degree burglary and petty larceny. He was convicted and served a 2-year prison sentence, followed by 30 additional days in a boot camp-style correctional program before being released in the late 1990s. Despite being married, he maintained an on and off relationship with Candy Louise Martin, whom he had known since childhood. Known as Candy, their relationship included occasional sexual and drug-related encounters, as she was also a crack user and frequent buyer. His wife was pregnant at the time of his arrest, and 6 months later, their daughter was born. Bowman maintained strong ties with both during his years in prison. February 16, 2001 began as an ordinary day in Branchville until tensions between Marion and Candy escalated irreversibly. That afternoon, while riding with his sister Yolanda and cousin Katrina, Bowman saw Candy in her car talking to a man. He asked his sister to pull over and tried to get Candy's attention from the back seat. Candy told him to wait because she was in the middle of a conversation. That response enraged Bowman, who then loudly declared in front of witnesses, "That bitch is going to be dead before nightfall." That threat turned into reality. At 7:30 p.m., Candy picked up Bowman and his cousin James Gadsden. They were supposedly heading to a party, but during the drive, Bowman asked her to detour onto Nursery Road, a remote and wooded area. Once there, he told Candy to turn off the headlights. He got out of the car with James and walked a few steps. According to Gadsden, Bowman said he believed Candy was wearing a wire and stated his intention to kill her. When they returned toward the car, Candy stepped out and began walking down the road. Bowman followed closely behind her. Suddenly, he pulled out a gun and fired 3 shots. Candy, wounded, ran toward James for help, then stopped, turned back to Bowman and pleaded, "Please don't shoot me anymore. I have a baby to take care of." Showing no mercy, Bowman fired 2 more times, killing her instantly. He dragged her body into the woods and returned to the car as if nothing had happened. Bowman drove Candy's car around the city, tried to sell it outside a club, and picked up other people throughout the night. During that time, he also bragged about the crime to another person, Hiram Johnson. At 3 a.m., he went to Travis Felder's house. Together, they returned to Nursery Road. Bowman went into the woods, dragged Candy's body back to the car, and placed it in the trunk. He then doused the vehicle with flammable liquid, lit it on fire, and watched it burn. "You didn't think I'd do it, did you? I killed Candy Martin," he told Travis. At 3:30 a.m. on February 17th, a nearby resident was awakened by a loud noise. When he went to check the road, he found the car completely engulfed in flames. He called 911. Firefighters arrived within minutes. Once the fire was extinguished and the trunk was opened, they discovered a charred human body curled from the heat. The scene was both brutal and unsettling. Despite the melted license plate, it was still partially legible. The car was registered to Candy Martin, who had been reported missing just hours earlier. The autopsy confirmed she had been shot twice, once in the torso and once in the head before being set on fire. At the scene, investigators found 6 .380 caliber shell casings, an earring, strands of hair, a large pool of blood, and a black high-heeled shoe located about 30 feet into the woods. All evidence was linked to Candy through forensic testing. Bowman was arrested that same day. In his pocket was Candy's wristwatch. He claimed she had given it to him in exchange for drugs. He was formally charged with murder and premeditated arson. In June 2001, a grand jury indicted him, and his trial was held in May 2002 in St. George. Prosecutor Walter Bailey presented a solid case built on physical evidence and testimony from Gadsden, Felder, and multiple witnesses. The defense argued that the witnesses had accepted plea deals and were unreliable. They also suggested the gun might have been planted by police and raised claims of racial discrimination, as Bowman was black and Candy was white. The defense also claimed that one of the trial witnesses had confessed to the crime, although that person's identity was unclear and the claim did not succeed. On May 24, 2002, the jury deliberated for only 3 hours before finding Bowman guilty of both murder and arson. He was sentenced to death for the murder and 10 years in prison for the arson charge. James Gadsden was sentenced to 20 years for accessory after the fact and failure to report the crime. He was released on parole in under 5 years. Travis Felder received a suspended sentence of 3 years probation and never served time in prison. During his more than 2 decades on death row, Bowman filed numerous appeals at the state and federal levels. In 2005 and 2018, the South Carolina Supreme Court denied his motions. In 2020, U.S. District Judge Terry L. Wooten upheld his conviction, ruling that his constitutional rights had not been violated. In 2022, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals also rejected his appeal. Bowman was one of several inmates who sued the state over the use of the electric chair and firing squad, arguing they were unconstitutional due to the unnecessary suffering they caused. In September 2023, South Carolina announced it had acquired new lethal injection drugs. In July 2024, the state Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of all 3 execution methods. Bowman was represented by civil rights groups like the ACLU, which filed a lawsuit to lift the state's ban on media interviews and inmate publications. Federal Judge Jacqueline D. Austin dismissed the case, citing institutional security. Despite the setback, Bowman continued writing. 2 hours before his death, he released his collection, My Thoughts, a Final Attempt to Leave Something Behind, a book of poems reflecting his emotions, regrets, thoughts on incarceration, and spiritual questions. Bowman participated in Bible studies, supported fellow inmates with mental health issues, and maintained a close friendship with fellow death row inmate Richard Moore, executed on November 1, 2024. Moore taught him to read, play chess, and remain calm. Since August 2024, Bowman was placed under 24-hour death watch in what his attorneys described as inhumane conditions. Following a court ruling authorizing 6 executions between 2024 and 2025, Bowman was listed alongside Freddie Owens, Richard Moore, Brad Sigmund, Stephen Bixby, and Mikkel Mahdi. After Owens and Moore were executed, Bowman was expected to be next. His execution was initially set for December 2024, but was postponed after an appeal argued for a break in executions during the holidays. The South Carolina Supreme Court agreed and halted new death warrants until January 3, 2025. That day, the court issued Bowman's execution order. He chose lethal injection. On January 31, 2025, Marion Bowman Jr. was executed by lethal injection at Broad River Correctional Institution. He was 44 years old. His last meal included seafood, fried chicken, onion rings, banana pudding, German chocolate cake, and pineapple and cranberry juice. He was pronounced dead at 6:27 p.m., becoming the first person executed in the U.S. that year. His final statement, read by his attorneys, reaffirmed his innocence and expressed hope that Candy Martin's family could find peace. The victim's family did not attend, but released a statement saying justice had been served. They noted that while Bowman had 24 years to watch his daughter and granddaughter grow up, Candy had been murdered when her son was just 2 years old. Bowman's autopsy revealed he, like Moore, had received 2 doses of pentobarbital, raising new concerns about the potential for conscious suffering during execution. This information was later cited by Brad Sigmund's attorneys to try to halt his execution, arguing that toxicology reports indicated fluid in the lungs and signs consistent with conscious drowning sensations. On February 5, 2025, after spending 12 years on death row, Stephen Lawayne Nelson was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. His death came just 13 days before his 38th birthday. He had been convicted of the brutal murder of a young pastor inside his own church, a case that left a deep scar on the community. Today we recall his story from his final moments to the crime that put him on death row. Stephen Lawayne Nelson was born on February 18, 1987, in the city of Ada, Oklahoma. His childhood was marked by abandonment, neglect, and domestic violence. He grew up in a deeply dysfunctional environment. His mother, far from offering basic care, would disappear for 3 to 4 days at a time, leaving the children completely alone without food or supervision. His father, meanwhile, was mostly absent, and when he was around, he inflicted physical and emotional abuse on both his wife and children. Stephen's sister had a hearing disability, which added more pressure on the siblings to survive in extreme conditions. By age 3, Stephen was already exhibiting highly disturbing behavior. One day, he dragged his mother's mattress into the living room and tried to set it on fire. That early action was one of the first signs of severe emotional dysregulation. By the age of 6, he was involved in petty thefts, break-ins, and aggressive conduct. Although Oklahoma's juvenile system took notice, institutional responses were insufficient or delayed. He was sent to a high-security juvenile facility at a very young age, a place that, far from rehabilitating him, reinforced his isolation and antisocial behavior. Later, the family moved to Texas in search of a fresh start, but the story repeated itself. Instability, lack of emotional support, and negative influences persisted. At age 14, he was arrested for vehicle theft, breaking and entering, and unauthorized use of property. In an unusual move, the judge imposed an indefinite sentence in the Texas juvenile system, typically reserved for violent offenses. Although it was supposed to be a 9-month stay, Stephen ended up spending more than 3.5 years in juvenile custody due to multiple rule violations. His record included at least 4 high-level disciplinary hearings. Upon reaching adulthood, he was released on parole twice, but he repeatedly violated the terms. At 18, he was arrested for driving a stolen car. In 2007, he committed 2 consecutive thefts at Walmart. In the first, he hid a laptop in his clothes while pretending to be an employee. In the second, he wore out a pair of new boots without paying. In 2010, after being released from prison, he physically assaulted his then partner. Prosecutors charged him with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Although the victim submitted a non-prosecution affidavit, the district attorney denied it due to Nelson's extensive criminal record. He was sentenced to probation and sent to the Intermediate Sanctions Facility for 90 days. At the time of the 2011 crime, Stephen was still formally under judicial supervision but had missed his latest appointment with his probation officer. On the morning of March 3, 2011, a Thursday, everything seemed calm at North Point Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas. Inside the building was Pastor Clint Dobson, 28, a charismatic young man deeply committed to his community. He was known for remembering everyone's name and genuinely asking how they were. Also present was 69-year-old Judy Elliott, the church secretary known for her loyalty, kindness, and perfect attendance record. At 9 a.m., Stephen Nelson entered the church. He wasn't there to pray, he was there to rob. What followed was a sudden wave of violence. According to the reconstruction of events, he attacked Pastor Clint first. It is believed he used a computer monitor stand as a weapon, striking Clint on the head. Clint tried to defend himself but was overpowered. Nelson strangled him with a computer cord and then suffocated him with a plastic bag. He then turned to Judy Elliott with extreme brutality. She suffered multiple fractures to her skull, face, arms, legs, and spine. Her face was so disfigured that her own husband didn't recognize her. She also suffered a brain hemorrhage and lost consciousness before the attack ended. After Nelson believed his task was done, he stole Clint's laptop, cell phones, Judy's credit cards, and her car keys. He calmly walked out as if it were just another day. He drove the stolen car and used the credit cards to buy gas, cigarettes, and drinks. Later, he went to Parks Mall in Arlington and bought an Oscar the Grouch t-shirt, Air Max sneakers, and costume jewelry, all paid with Judy's cards. He returned later with friends but couldn't make further purchases as the cards had been canceled. That night, at a friend's apartment, Stephen showed off his new items wearing the t-shirt, shoes, and jewelry. He openly confessed what he had done, that he had robbed a pastor and attacked people at a church. After taking pills and smoking, he sent several text messages to his cousin. One read, "It might be the last time." Another said, "I did some the other day, cuz." And finally, "I up bad cuz real bad." For the first time, he seemed to acknowledge the magnitude of his actions. Around noon, members of the congregation started to worry. Clint Dobson had planned to meet church member Dale Harwell for lunch but never arrived or called. Deborah Jenkins, another church member, arrived at 12:40 p.m. and noticed both Clint's and Judy's cars parked outside, but the building was eerily quiet. She knocked and rang the bell but got no answer. Feeling uneasy, she left, only to return 15 minutes later to find Judy's car gone. Clint's wife, Laura Dobson, had also been calling repeatedly without response. Distressed, she contacted Jake Turner, the church's music minister, who in turn contacted John Elliott. John went straight to the church and used his access code. Inside, he found chaos. Papers scattered, drawers open, furniture overturned. Then he saw a bloodied woman on the floor, so badly beaten he didn't recognize his wife. He called 911. Officer Jesse Parrish arrived and discovered Clint's body behind the desk, tied up with a collapsed plastic bag over his face. Judy was barely alive. She was rushed to the hospital where she suffered cardiac arrest but survived. She underwent reconstructive surgery and 5 months of intensive therapy. She recovered enough to identify Nelson as her attacker. Police already had clues. Nelson had missed his probation check-in that day. Security footage showed him using the credit cards, and his car contained the victim's belongings and blood-stained shoes. Fingerprints at the scene matched. He was arrested and charged with capital murder. Another young man, Anthony Springs, was also arrested, but later released due to lack of evidence. While awaiting trial in Tarrant County Jail, Nelson engaged in multiple violent incidents. On March 19, 2012, he murdered inmate Jonathan Holden, a man with a history of mental illness. Nelson lured Holden to the cell bars, fashioned a noose from a bedsheet, and strangled him to death. He later celebrated by playing a broom like a guitar. In 2014, Holden's family sued the county and received a $350,000 settlement. At trial, Nelson blamed Springs and Claude Jefferson, claiming he only robbed but did not kill. The jury was not convinced. Springs was 30 miles away at the time, and Jefferson's alibi and exam was refuted by a professor. On October 8, 2012, the jury found Nelson guilty. During sentencing, prosecutors presented his entire history: childhood crimes, prison violence, and the Holden murder. A psychiatrist diagnosed Nelson with ADHD and antisocial personality disorder. On October 16th, he was sentenced to death. In anger, he broke a courtroom sprinkler, flooding the room. He was transferred to the Polunsky unit, where he spent 12 years on death row. He filed numerous appeals. In 2015, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied them. In 2017, federal judge John H. McBride rejected his petition. In 2020, the Fifth Circuit upheld that decision. In 2023, the same court dismissed his final attempt. On June 10, 2024, Judge Stephen Jooms signed the execution order. On February 3, 2025, in a final interview, Nelson maintained his innocence, insisting he only committed robbery.
There's many innocent people here on death row or in prison that shouldn't be here. It's hard at times, you know, because you're waiting to be put to death. So that kind of breaks a little part of you every day. Kind of breaks you every day. And sometimes I have to catch myself, you know, for being overwhelmed and stressed out, you know, and like forcing myself to eat because it does that to you where you just don't want to do nothing.
On February 5, 2025, he was transferred to the Huntsville unit. He was not granted a special last meal and ate the standard prison dinner. He was Texas's first execution of the year and, as of July, the youngest. At 6:26 p.m., the injection began. In his final words, he addressed his wife, whom he had married by mail 3 months earlier. "I will always love you no matter. Our love is uncontrollable. I'm at peace. I'm ready to be at home. Let's ride, Warden." He looked toward the witness room, whispered love, and his body tensed. He was pronounced dead at 6:50 p.m. The Dobson family issued a statement honoring his dedication to faith and community. Several churches, Catholic, Methodist, and Episcopal, opposed the execution. Nonetheless, most American Christians continued to support capital punishment, according to a 2021 poll. Judy Elliott's family, though they had forgiven Nelson, chose not to comment publicly. Her son, representing her memory, witnessed the execution. Demetrius Terrence Frazier spent more than 3 decades behind bars, including 14 years on Alabama's death row. On February 6, 2025, at age 52, he was executed via nitrogen hypoxia at Holman Prison, becoming the first person put to death in the state that year. His story didn't end with his last breath. It began much earlier on a November night in Birmingham, when a woman was sleeping peacefully in her apartment, unaware she would never wake up again. Demetrius Terrence Frazier was born on October 29, 1972 in Michigan. He was raised by his mother Carol and a sister in an environment marked by instability and neglect. He was at times under social services care and from a young age exhibited delinquent behavior, sneaking out at night to commit theft and dropping out of high school early. Before reaching adulthood, he already had charges for carrying concealed weapons, breaking and entering, and probation violations. He was sent to the W.J. Maxey Boys Training School where he earned his GED. Yet it wasn't enough to redirect his life. By age 18, he had an extensive criminal record. By 19, he would become a murderer. On the night of November 27, 1991 in Birmingham, Alabama, 40-year-old Pauline Brown slept on her apartment couch while the television flickered, casting a blue glow across the room. She had been working late the previous night. Outside, Frazier wandered aimlessly. Spotting the light, he decided to break in. He carefully removed the window screen and slipped inside silently. He moved through the apartment like a shadow, rifling drawers in search of money. He found a few wrinkled bills, about $10. Then he found Pauline still sleeping. He woke her, demanded more money, and she handed over $80. He then raped her at gunpoint. She begged for her life, spoke of her family, begged him to let her go. But he did not stop. He shot her in the head. He stepped outside briefly to ensure no one heard him. Returning, he confirmed she was dead. He searched for more money, ate something, and vanished into the night. He discarded the gun along the way. The next morning, her co-worker Tyrone Mitchell waited outside her home. She was supposed to pick him up for work. When she didn't show, he went to her apartment. Pauline's car was still parked there, but the place was dark and silent. With the help of 2 maintenance workers, he opened a window and entered. He found Pauline lying face down in her bedroom, lifeless. She was a mother of 2 daughters and had recently become a grandmother. Her first grandchild had been born only weeks earlier. She would never know them. On March 8, 1992, in Detroit, tragedy struck again. 14-year-old Crystal Kendrick was later found deceased in an abandoned house. She had faced instability after being separated from her mother, who struggled with addiction. Friends remembered her as quiet, kind, and respectful, but without guidance at home, she began slipping through the cracks. That day, her path crossed with Frazier. Authorities reported that she was trying to escape when she was fatally shot. Her story ended in that forgotten place, and Frazier left without looking back. Following Kendrick's murder, Michigan police quickly identified Frazier as a suspect. He was arrested that same month. While in custody, he first confessed to killing Kendrick and then to murdering Pauline Brown. His trial in Michigan began in 1992. Frazier faced charges of murder and raping 8 women. He attempted to suppress his confession, claiming emotional manipulation, asserting that Detective Monica Childs had seduced him and promised he wouldn't be returned to Alabama. The court dismissed his claims. On April 8, 1993, he was convicted of first-degree murder and weapons possession, receiving 2 life sentences. In October, he was again sentenced by Michigan courts for 2 rapes and an armed robbery preceding Kendrick's murder. He received 2 more life sentences plus 60 to 90 years. In Alabama, he faced capital murder charges. On June 5, 1996, he was found guilty of murder during a robbery and murder during a rape. While the verdict was being read, he threw a pen at the jury, comprised mostly of white jurors, and accused them of racism. On June 7th, the jury voted 10-2 in favor of the death penalty. On August 8th, Judge Mike McCormick formally sentenced him to death for Pauline's murder and to life imprisonment for the rape. During the first 18 years of his sentence, Frazier remained in the custody of the Michigan Department of Corrections, serving his multiple life sentences at Alger Maximum Correctional Facility. However, despite Michigan having abolished the death penalty in 1846, becoming one of the first states to do so, Frazier still had a pending capital conviction in Alabama, where the death penalty was legal and regularly enforced. In 2011, after years of waiting, a formal agreement was reached between then Michigan Governor Rick Snyder and his Alabama counterpart Robert J. Bentley. This agreement authorized Frazier's transfer to the Alabama prison system to serve his death sentence. Thus, nearly 2 decades after being sentenced to death, Demetrius was moved to Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, a prison known for housing death row inmates and having its own execution chamber. While in Alabama, Frazier filed a series of appeals before various judicial bodies. On January 10, 1999, the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals rejected his first formal attempt to overturn his death sentence. Months later, on December 30, 1999, the Alabama Supreme Court upheld that decision and dismissed his appeal. Frazier tried again in 2003, but on February 28th of that year, his request for review was denied once more. Years later, on October 25, 2011, the 11th Circuit Court also rejected his appeal, paving the way for his transfer from Michigan. Finally, on October 1, 2012, the United States Supreme Court denied any possibility of federal relief, leaving his execution in the hands of the state of Alabama. In parallel, Frazier became involved in several legal actions against the execution methods used in Alabama, particularly the use of midazolam in lethal injections. In 2015, he was one of 5 inmates who sued the state, arguing that administering high doses of this sedative was unconstitutional. They claimed it did not ensure immediate unconsciousness and could cause unnecessary pain and suffering. He also requested to be executed by alternative methods, such as firing squad or hanging, options that were rejected by the federal judiciary. Amid growing controversy, in 2018, the state of Alabama approved the use of nitrogen hypoxia as an alternative method of execution. Frazier was one of the inmates who opted for this method, which involves depriving the body of oxygen through the inhalation of pure nitrogen gas. In his final hours, Frazier received visits from his mother and sister, who stayed with him until the end. His last meal was from Taco Bell, a 5-layer burrito, a chicken supreme chalupa, crunchy beef tacos, nachos with dip, and a Mountain Dew. At 6:00 p.m., he was escorted to the execution chamber. As the nitrogen gas began to flow, witnesses observed shallow breathing followed by intermittent spasms. At 6:21 p.m., his body stopped moving. 13 minutes after the procedure began, medical personnel confirmed that his heart had stopped. He was officially declared dead at 6:36 p.m. In his final statement, Frazier apologized to Pauline Brown's family and to the African American community. He then publicly criticized Governor Whitmer for not intervening in his case and urged the media to contact a former Michigan detective, claiming that his confession in the Crystal Kendrick case had been false. His final words were, "Detroit, I love everyone on death row, let's go." Following the execution, Governor Kay Ivey stated that Alabama had acted within the law and reaffirmed that rapists and murderers had no place in society. "Justice has been served," she said. Attorney General Steve Marshall called Frazier a monster who left behind a trail of violence and asserted that his punishment was fair and proportional. Frazier's defense, in turn, condemned both states. They accused Michigan of failing to protect one of its citizens and criticized Alabama for denying clemency and executing a man who, in their view, no longer posed a threat. To them, justice had been confused with vengeance. Richard Lee Tabler spent 17 years on death row in Texas after being convicted of murdering 4 people in 2004, including 2 teenage girls. On February 13, 2025, just 8 days after turning 46, he was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. That night, he was not granted a special last meal, but what he said before dying surprised many. To understand how he got to that point, we must go back to his childhood and to a week before Thanksgiving Day. Richard Lee Tabler was born on February 5, 1979, in Tulare County, California, into a family marked by conflict and instability. Even before his birth, his arrival was rejected by his father, Robert Tabler, who tried to convince his wife Lawayne to terminate the pregnancy. This early tension marked the beginning of a fractured childhood. During his early years, Richard witnessed a dysfunctional marriage. His father, an alcoholic frequently absent due to work obligations, was also involved in extramarital affairs. His mother was barely present due to long work hours. Maternal care was practically non-existent. She left him in the care of his older siblings, and when Richard was just 10, she left the household for good. Tabler's life was marked by constant relocation, moving between Florida, Nevada, and primarily California, depending on which parent he was living with at the time. In school, he struggled to adapt. He repeated 3rd grade, had difficulty concentrating, and lacked an environment that nurtured emotional and academic development. At age 12, he was diagnosed with ADHD, a condition that further complicated his ability to function. Though his mother and sister described him as having a good heart, they also noted his volatile temper. The lack of emotional structure and early abandonment deeply shaped his behavior. In adulthood, his troubles escalated. He was convicted of 2nd-degree burglary, assaulted a police officer, escaped from custody while handcuffed, and issued serious threats to his parole officer, telling him he would take care of him and his family. On a personal level, he had a relationship with a woman who had a daughter from a previous relationship. That relationship also ended shortly before his arrest. First double murder, November 26, 2004. A conflict with Mohammed Amin Ramouni, Tabler's former boss at the nightclub Teasers, escalated rapidly in late 2004. Tabler claimed Ramouni had threatened his family, igniting a desire for revenge. By November 18th, just 1 week before the killings, he had already made up his mind. In the following days, he prepared meticulously. He acquired a 9mm pistol, a pickup truck, and a camcorder. It was a deliberate, calculated, and cold-blooded act. On Thanksgiving Day, while families were gathering for dinner, Tabler called Ramouni, offering to sell him stereo equipment at a low price. Ramouni agreed, unaware that it was a trap. He arrived with his friend Hytham Frank Zayed. Tabler and his 18-year-old accomplice Timothy Payne were already waiting in a dark parking lot. As soon as the vehicle arrived, Tabler shot Zayed and then Ramouni. He pulled both men out of the car and, seeing that Ramouni was still alive, shot him again. Payne filmed parts of the attack with the camcorder. After the murders, Tabler looted the car, taking a wallet and a black bag. That same night, he called the sheriff's office to confess, but he made it clear he wasn't done yet. Second double murder, November 28, 2004. Tabler had a list of 11 people linked to Teaser's nightclub that, according to him, had to die. Among the names were 2 teenage dancers, 16-year-old Amanda Benefield and 18-year-old Tiffany Lorraine Dotson. Tabler believed they had tipped off police about the first killings. On November 28th, he lured them in with the promise of drugs. He drove them to a remote lake. There he murdered them using the same weapon from the previous attack. Once again, he called the sheriff not to confess but to boast about the killings and threaten more violence if the club wasn't shut down. Amanda and Tiffany's bodies were discovered by an employee of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Tiffany was identified quickly. Amanda, being a missing minor from Louisiana, took several more days to identify. Her identity was confirmed on December 4th. That same November 28th, Tabler was arrested on unrelated theft charges. However, investigators already suspected his involvement in the killings. During questioning, Tabler confessed to all 4 murders and named Timothy Payne as his accomplice in the Thanksgiving night crimes. Payne was arrested shortly thereafter. On November 30th, both were formally charged with the murders of Ramouni and Zayed. On December 10th, Tabler was additionally charged with the murders of Amanda and Tiffany. Despite his confession, he pleaded not guilty in court. The trial began in March 2007. On March 21st, Tabler was found guilty of the November 26th murders. On April 2nd, he was sentenced to death for both counts. Oddly, though the charges for Amanda and Tiffany's murders remained open, he was never tried for them. As for Payne, he was tried in November 2007, found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole until 2044. The prosecution chose not to seek the death penalty in his case. Tabler was transferred to the Polunsky unit, where he spent 17 years on death row. In October 2008, he attempted suicide and was temporarily moved to the Jester 4 unit. That same month, he became involved in one of the most notorious incidents of his incarceration, using a smuggled cell phone to threaten Texas State Senator John Whitmire, claiming to know personal details about his family. Investigations revealed that the device had been shared by 10 inmates. The discovery triggered a statewide prison lockdown. His mother, Lawayne, was arrested after it was determined she had brought the phone and purchased airtime. In 2009, Tabler received an additional 10-year sentence for the incident. Between 2008 and 2012, he also sent multiple threatening letters to Senator Whitmire. On one occasion, he convinced a Methodist prison chaplain to smuggle letters out of the facility. He even issued threats through a personal blog. Despite his past, Tabler claimed to have found faith in his later years. He spent his time drawing, writing books, and guiding other inmates in spiritual matters. According to witnesses, he also cared for fellow prisoners. One widely known story involved a small lizard named Little Blue that he found in his cell and raised with care. He taught it to climb on him, fed it cockroaches, and let it rest on his head. The name Little Blue wasn't random, it was also Tabler's own prison nickname, and naming the reptile after himself became a symbolic emotional bond. Amid his long incarceration, Tabler also formed a significant personal relationship. He married a woman he met through a prison pen pal program. What began as letter exchanges turned into a deep emotional connection. She publicly supported him in his final years, insisting that Richard was no longer the man who had committed those crimes. In her words, she had never met anyone with a heart as big even outside prison. In December 2024, a death warrant was signed. Tabler was one of 4 inmates scheduled for execution in Texas during the first quarter of 2025. In his final days, Tabler chose not to file any more appeals. However, his attorneys convinced him to submit a clemency petition to Governor Greg Abbott. The request highlighted his spiritual transformation, genuine remorse, and positive influence within the prison. They argued that if his sentence were commuted to life imprisonment, he could continue contributing to the rehabilitation of others. On February 13, 2025, at 6:38 p.m., Richard Lee Tabler was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. He was the 5th person executed in the United States that year. Coincidentally, on the same day, another death row inmate, James Dennis Ford, was executed in the state of Florida just 1 hour earlier. Although the two cases were unrelated, the timing attracted attention from media and activists alike. Tabler was not granted a special last meal and ate the same food as other inmates that day. In his final statement, he addressed the victims' families with the following words: "There is not a day that goes by that I don't regret my actions. I had no right to take your loved ones from you, and I ask and pray, hope and pray that one day you find it in your hearts to forgive me for those actions. No amount of my apologies will ever return them to you." He thanked his family, legal team, and the prison staff. He said he hoped to begin a new life in heaven. Addressing the warden, he said, "I am finished." As the lethal drugs began to flow through his veins, he softly whispered, "I'm sorry." He breathed rapidly a few more times, then his body went still. He was pronounced dead at 6:38 p.m. James Dennis Ford spent over 26 years on death row after committing a chilling crime. He was executed by lethal injection on February 13, 2025 at Florida State Prison, bringing an end to a wait that lasted more than 2 decades. He had been convicted in 1999 for the brutal murder of Gregory and Kimberly Malnery, a young married couple he lured under the false pretense of a fishing trip. What happened that day would forever mark the history of their community and of a little girl who survived. James Dennis Ford was born on July 23, 1960. His life from childhood was marked by abandonment, isolation, and alcoholism. His mother left the family when he was just 14 years old, disappearing from his life without explanation. His father, a chronic alcoholic, became his only emotional support. Ford dropped out of school at an early age and began working alongside his father as a cemetery caretaker. His tasks were harsh and silent, cleaning headstones, digging graves, and maintaining the grounds where others buried their dead. That routine continued until his father died at age 52, also due to alcohol abuse. The loss devastated Ford. He had already started drinking in his teens, but his father's death was the tipping point. He went from occasional drinking to consuming up to 24 cans of beer a day, as confirmed by friends and his first wife during the trial. His addiction became part of his identity. Despite everything, Ford had no serious criminal record and no history of violence. Family members and acquaintances described him as quiet, withdrawn, and non-confrontational. He seemed like a troubled man, but not a dangerous one. That image would be brutally shattered in April 1997. During his trial, the defense argued that Ford was not an evil man, but rather someone emotionally broken. They presented psychological reports indicating low IQ and signs of cognitive impairment. They claimed he suffered from developmental delays and was incapable of fully understanding the magnitude of his actions. The prosecution painted a very different picture, one of a man capable of planning, executing, and concealing a horrific crime with absolute coldness. On Sunday, April 6, 1997, Gregory Philip Malnery, 25, and his wife Kimberly Ann Malnery, 26, accepted an invitation from James Ford to spend the afternoon fishing at the South Florida Sod Farm in Charlotte County, Florida. Ford was Greg's co-worker and had presented the idea as a peaceful family outing. The couple brought their 22-month-old daughter Miranda in their pickup truck. The setting seemed ideal, a wide, isolated farm with open fields and ponds. What the family didn't know was that it was a trap. Upon arrival, Ford attacked Greg first. He shot him in the back of the head with a .22 caliber rifle. The shot wasn't immediately fatal. Bleeding and disoriented, Greg tried to flee on foot across the open field. Ford followed him step by step calmly. When he caught up, he struck him at least 7 times in the face and head with a blunt object. Finally, he turned him over and slit his throat from ear to ear, so deeply that it exposed the muscle. Kimberly, having witnessed the horror, tried to protect her daughter. Despite an old leg injury, she managed to reach the truck and strap Miranda into her car seat. But before she could escape, Ford caught her. He assaulted her with extreme violence, 9 blunt force blows to the head, one of which fractured her skull. She had defensive wounds on her arms, indicating she fought back until the end. Forensic analysis revealed Kimberly was alive when she was raped. Ford tore through the swimsuit she wore beneath her clothes, and traces of his semen were found on both her body and clothing. After the sexual assault, he executed her by placing the rifle barrel in her mouth and firing. All of this happened just feet from the truck where Miranda sat, strapped into her car seat. Ford didn't harm her physically. He simply walked away, leaving her trapped for over 18 hours in the Florida heat, with no food or water. She was eventually found dehydrated, covered in insect bites, and soaked in her mother's blood. On the afternoon of April 7, 1997, a sod farm worker came across the scene. The Malnori's truck was parked in the middle of an open field with its doors wide open in an eerie silence. Greg's body was found shortly after, and Kimberly's was located nearby. Miranda was still alive in the back seat. She was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital in Port Charlotte in a state of dehydration and shock. The investigation quickly focused on James Ford. He had been the last person seen with the couple. During questioning, Ford's story was inconsistent. He claimed he had gone hunting alone and returned to find the couple gone, but his account shifted repeatedly. Witnesses had seen him that evening with blood on his face, hands, and clothing. He also had visible scratches on his body. On April 17th, Ford was arrested. The next day, he was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. On April 30th, a grand jury added charges of premeditated murder, felony murder, armed robbery, sexual battery, and child abuse. In May, the prosecution confirmed they would seek the death penalty. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Parts of Ford's rifle were found in a ditch near where his truck had broken down. His pocket knife contained Greg's DNA. Ford's DNA was found on and in Kimberly's body and on her clothing. The marks on her body matched the brutality described in the autopsy. His version of events crumbled under forensic scrutiny. James Ford's trial began on February 1st, 1999, after he was ruled mentally competent. On March 8th, the jury found him guilty on all counts: 2 counts of first-degree murder, sexual battery with a firearm, and child abuse. On April 23rd, the jury recommended the death penalty by an 11-1 vote. On June 3rd, Judge Cynthia Ellis sentenced Ford to death and added 19 years for sexual battery and 5 years for child abuse. Ford filed multiple appeals over the years. In 2001, the Florida Supreme Court denied his first direct appeal. In 2007, a second appeal claiming ineffective legal representation was also rejected. Appeals in 2009, 2012, 2015, and 2018 were likewise dismissed. As Miranda grew older, she learned the full details of her parents' murder at the age of 13. Though she has no memory of the crime, she has said that living without them left a painful void, one she eventually turned into strength. On January 10, 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis signed Ford's death warrant. His legal team filed last-minute appeals, claiming Ford had a mental age of 14. The Florida Supreme Court rejected the argument on February 7th. The U.S. Supreme Court denied a further appeal on February 12th, citing insufficient grounds to override the execution under Roper v. Simmons. On February 13, 2025, James Dennis Ford was executed by lethal injection at 6:19 p.m. at Florida State Prison. He was 64 years old. It was Florida's first execution of the year and the 4th in the United States. That morning, he woke at 3:30 a.m. and met with 3 family members and his legal team. For his final meal, he requested steak, macaroni and cheese, fried okra, sweet potato, pumpkin pie, and sweet tea. When asked by the warden if he had any last words, Ford said nothing. He left behind a handwritten note: "Hugs, prayers, love God, bless everyone." During the execution, his chest rose and fell at first, then slowly stopped. A staff member shouted, "Ford! Ford!" to check for consciousness, but there was no response. He was pronounced dead at 6:19 p.m. In the execution chamber, Connie Ankney watched in silence. Later, she said, "I hope he burns in hell." Deidre Parkinson, Kimberly's stepmother, expressed relief but felt Ford's death was too peaceful. Miranda, now 30 years old, stated that she never wished for Ford's death but felt a sense of peace now that it was over. This case is filed, but your comment could reveal new evidence, and with a like and a subscription, you'll help uncover new cases. For now, this story is filed. Choose the next case file and continue the investigation.